Hi all. Our notable game today returns to the classic match between Kasparov and Karpov from 1984 to 1985. This was game 32. Please excuse the background sound effects today. It seems to be a very windy day today. So Kasparov, playing white, played d4 and Karpov reacted with knight f6, c4, e6, and instead of going to the main Nimzo Indian defense, Kasparov sidesteps with knight f3. So this is Queen's Indian territory. If you play the Nimzo Indian, you need to know about the Queen's Indian. b6 is played here. Usually d5, that's quite popular as well, but b6 is very popular as well. Black's trying to exert a central influence over that key e4 square and try and restrict white from playing the move e4. We have knight c3. Now e4 is threatened. Bishop b7. So hypermodern, trying to control the center. Now in hypermodern tradition here, there's also it could transpose back into a Nimzo Indian. If, for example, e3, then black could play the Nimzo Indian, move bishop b4, pinning the knight. Kasparov elects to avoid this possibility. He plays actually a3, so prophylaxis against the pin. And we have now d5. Black clamps down against e4 from white, but he hems in his own bishop. Kasparov actually took on d5 here. Knight takes d5 was played. So black doesn't want a pawn on d5, which would block this bishop. Queen c2, and it looks as though it does two things really. There's an option to maybe on take with the queen. That's possible, but I think the more important thing is it supports also e4. So even if taking and white wants to take with the pawn, then e4 is supported. The queen seems well placed in this particular position on this diagonal and potentially against c7. We have knight d7, and now Kasparov actually took on d5, and he encourages black to basically take with a pawn here. This is actually more common, it seems, in linebook than bishop takes d5. There's 22 games with e takes and only 5 with bishop takes. They're both thought to be a small advantage for white. We have e takes d5, so black is keeping that lock on e4. Now a very interesting move, bishop g5. There's a slight snag with c7 here, so it looks as though the natural bishop e7 might be met with the kind of just forcing move, bishop takes e7, and then maybe taking on c7. So black here, the move bishop e7 is not really played. In linebook actually, it seems to have occurred in 6 games where black has actually had to take with the king. That's just terrible. It's a clear advantage to white, marked in linebook. So this has some venom, this bishop g5. The queen is looking at c7 here. So Karpov is forced into a concession which he really doesn't want to play, f6. The problem with f6, it's weakening light squares. It's weakening light squares on this diagonal, and also this bishop, which hasn't committed itself, doesn't even have to go to this diagonal. It could later, either with g3, h4, or just g3, go to this diagonal where it's got access to these key squares. So this is an important concession that has been made, f6. So Kasparov is doing well now at move 10. He retreats the bishop, looking at c7. So black actually protects that pawn by moving it c5. And now the bishop doesn't really have to commit to this diagonal. On e3, bishop d3, it might even be subject to tempo gain at some point. Actually, g3 is played. Now on g2, it might usefully id5 later, but also if h4 or even bishop h3 immediately, this diagonal is also of interest. We have now Karpov playing g6. And you might think, why is Karpov moving so many pawns in this game? It's interesting that, say, in this position, bishop e7 is played. It's fascinating how the light squares can actually potentially lose material here. This is an engine variation, bishop h3. Say black castles, Bishop f5, forcing yet another concession to protect h7. g6, which weakens dark squares now. And look at this, check. And here, a surprising move actually seems to win material, basically. Can you see what white can play in this position? If I give you 5 seconds, this is a variation. Okay, queen a4, it seems to win material. Because if the knight goes back now, it's awkward to protect the knight. If there, then maybe the queen can invade. But say the knight goes back, bishop h6 is actually winning an exchange in broad daylight like this. So it's fascinating stuff. It may explain why Karpov sensed some issues here and didn't want to routinely play bishop e7. So he plays the move g6, but of course that has some issues as well. And Kasparov plays h4, so ready to undermine this pawn structure, and also reserving the possibility of either bishop g2 or bishop h3. We have now queen e7. Karpov is not in a rush to commit his bishop to g7 yet. Bishop g2, deciding that maybe d5 is more important than this diagonal, because on this diagonal maybe black plays f5 and shuts out that bishop, at least temporarily. The bishop could retreat, of course, back. Bishop g7, and then we have the move h5. So Karpov has to do something about this undermining. He plays actually f5, which weakens the dark squares a little bit, but what else? You know, he's under fire here. So it seems a logical response to handle that. Queen d2 now. And it seems white has an ideal battery here to be able to swap off the dark square bishop if black castled routinely. Black might face some issues. For example, let's say Karpov castled. In the game he didn't. He played bishop f6. But say he castled hg, hg, bishop g5. And nudging the queen, and now bishop h6. It's annoying. That little finesse would get the g5 square potentially, so able to take and use the g5 as well more comfortably. This is nice for white, this position. So Karpov actually plays bishop f6. He's feeling some tactical pressure here, and now white doesn't routinely castle. Is this a more accurate move? Kasparov actually plays rook c1 with the idea rook c3 to e3 would be annoying, but also of course putting pressure on c5. That would skewer the queen if a rook got to e3, and Karpov makes provisions for that. He plays rook c8 to be able to defend symmetrically against this. So we see rook c3, rook c6. Now rook e3 is playing rook e6. So they basically exchanged off their queenside rooks. That's very, very unusual thing to happen. Exchanging off the queenside rooks with these rooks just not moving. Now a forcing move, knight g5, asking the queen to move. And of course it unveiled an attack. It was a double attack, not just on the queen, but d5 was hit with that move. So d takes c5 now. What is happening here? Is white just winning a pawn on d5? No, because Karpov's retreat keeps g5 pressure. White cannot afford to win a pawn here. Knight takes c5 is perfectly playable with this battery on g5. Interestingly enough, the engine thinks bishop takes d5 is equal for very, very technical, obscure reasons. I'll show you just briefly. Takes, even if it seems to lose a piece. The dynamics here are quite interesting for white after hg. This dynamic here, position, seems to be assessed roughly equal. It's a crazy line, absolutely crazy, but the assessment is given as about equal. It's crazy stuff. Okay, basically, yeah, Karpov is indirectly defending d5. We have h takes g6. And now, instead of capturing h takes g, we have the move d4 hitting the bishop. You might wonder why. Well, the reason is related to d5 again. On hg, then white could actually take on h8, relieving the pressure on g5, and now he's ready to take on d5, winning a pawn in broad daylight. So black is in a little bit of trouble here. He has to play that d4 move. It's a tactical move, hitting the bishop. So chaos has broken out in the position. And the Indians love this sort of position, and there's a technical move which apparently is quite good for white, but it's mind-boggling. Kasparov plays a relatively simple move in comparison, simple and strong g7, which means actually the pawn chain is less fragmented for white here. He's succeeded, at least, even if he's giving back the pawn, in fragmenting black's kingside pawns. The technical move here, for those interested, would seem to be knight f7. This seems to actually work. It's crazy, leaving the bishop hanging. Because after rook h2, then the rook is attacked, the bishop's attacked. And say rook f8, this is an engine line check. Rook takes h7. And the king is facing difficulties in the centre here, with bishop c7, knight d6 now being threatened to win the queen. So say bishop e5, which weakens d4. This is crazy stuff, but ultimately white would be technically in very, very good shape here. It's a total engine line, but it seems to be, theoretically speaking, in this position after d4, it seems, theoretically speaking, if it was a correspondence game with engines allowed, knight f7 is actually, it looks a completely crazy thing to do, but it seems to be very, very good for white in all variations here. We're talking a clear advantage. So the dynamics are very, very interesting. But yeah, simple and strong though, from a human point of view. g7, white just wants a better pawn structure out of this. He's hitting the rook, not giving black time to do much. So black takes on g7. And now simplification ensues. Bishop takes b7. Queen takes h1, threatened f3, which is a very, very useful move here. The knight can't go into e6, so when it's kicked, if it's kicked, it could actually usefully go to h3. It wasn't. If Karpov had played h6, knight h3 is heading for a very nice blockade square on d3 with the superior pawn structure here, even though they're equal on pawns. So say queen d5, knight f2, and now with knight f2 also threatening bishop takes h6, unleashing that rook. Say h5, white would stand very, very nicely here in this position. And this is not the sort of position black wants. Devoid of much counterplay, nice blockade for white, better pawn structure, black's pawns are fragmented. Instead, Karpov tries to play actively. He plays queen d5, giving up h7. Why on earth would he want to give up h7? This pawn sacrifice, this game's crazy. What's going on here? White takes up the challenge, calls Karpov's bluff. He takes the h7 pawn. So he's technically now, he's actually 2 pawns up. No, sorry, I've just had a mirage. He's just 1 pawn up. It looks so bad because of this pawn islands on its own. Black has 4 pawns, white has 5. White's a pawn up, rook takes h7, knight takes h7. What's Karpov's idea? b4 is now on the cards to kick that knight. Queen b3, the idea seems to be d3 to extend the scope of the bishop. It looks very dangerous to play d3 here. Kasparov is cool as a cucumber. He plays here bishop d6. So he's ready to take off that knight on c5, which is supporting d3. In the event of d3, he just snapped that knight off. The knight moves, but the knight is harassed now. Knight g5. Black is given no respite. We have simplification occurring after bishop h6. Bishop f4. The minor pieces are rapidly coming off the board. Bishop takes g5. Bishop takes g5. Knight takes g5, winning a pawn back, basically, but then losing f5. Karpov elects to do this. What else? If he goes back to protect d5, he's still a pawn down. So he takes on b2. Maybe he wants to like win a3 and use his 2 potential connected pass pawns on the queen side. But white has these pawns, especially this one. Sometimes it's not the number of pawns, but the speed of them, how easy they are to blockade. Check, 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 king g2, moving out the checks. Black takes on a3, so we're actually back to 3 pawns each. It's a pawn race. 3 pawns each, equal on pawns in this queen ending. Queen h5 check. White is forcibly winning this d4 pawn. It's loose, it's not protected by the queen. Check, doubling attack on the king and the pawn. So white is again a pawn up now. b5, black is trying to get the pawn going. g4. Now we'd reached move 40 and there's actually adjournments, believe it or not. Here, after b4, g5. Apparently in this position, Karpov resigned without resumption of the game. And some people argued maybe he should have played on. Let's have a look at this position. Why did Karpov resign? He must have looked at it in depth. Let's have a look. It's a complex position. The engine assesses it as nearly +2 for white. Let's imagine b3. Check. Now g6 seems natural, but in fact queen g6 might be stronger. To get the queen over here. And it looks as though, to be honest, there's a lot of play in the position. If queen e7, for example, that's playable. It looks as though white still has some technical issues here. So it doesn't seem entirely far from clear. Maybe Karpov was feeling exhausted. He didn't want to eventually be ground down. This position, it doesn't seem to be a clear-cut winning method, to be honest. But it seems to be evaluated as +2 for white. This kind of position. Maybe queen f5 check, keeping the g-pawn clear. But yeah, there's a lot of possibilities in this position, as there usually are in queen and pawn endings. Maybe g6, just letting black... if black is let with b2, it doesn't matter here. Check, for example. This shows white potentially winning here with queen f8 check. And then that'll be okay. Winning with his pawn. That's a massive advantage for white. But yeah, there's play left in the position, it seems. There's certainly play left in the position. But it seems here, yeah, if white tries to play with the g-pawn, this might be the best thing to do here with g6, letting b2 happen. Here, then there's queen d5 check as an example. g7. If we reach this sort of critical position, then if queening here, g8 queen, the problem here is actually black's king safety. Maybe this is the sort of position envisaged by the Karpov analysis team, that even if, when both sides queen, white's king seems to be more sheltered here, much more sheltered. So this is actually, believe it or not, even with 4 queens on the board here, the engine gives this as a forced mate in 7 for white. Doesn't matter what black does here, it's a forced mate in 7. Example, let's say queen d6, check. Then what? It's like losing the queen immediately. So what does black actually do? It seems to be a forced mate in 7, whatever black does. The longest... This I'll show you an example where it's giving up its queen ridiculously. It's so bad black's giving up its queen. So maybe this represents the general gist of it. It seems as though initially it's like far from clear, but actually it does seem as though the g-pawn can forcibly get a clear advantage around about here. Instead of queen g7, queen f5 check, and then just playing for g6 on king d8, simply g6 looks actually strong, saying to black, you queen, I queen, but the king is really unsafe here. Yeah, fascinating stuff. It's worthy of analysis. That seems to lose immediately, this one, to queen d5 check. That's like plus 49 here. If the king goes over here, then g7, we got that variation. And if black doesn't play b3 here, say queen b2, then check, and okay, e2 is a problem, so g7 is no big deal because the queen takes e2, but white plays check, check. It's complicated. It's check, protecting the pawn, that's the idea. And it seems black is fundamentally blocking in the pawn in this line. Yeah, it's still a lot of play. It's a grind. It's a long grind. But because so here it does seem as though it's technically it's like +3 now. But this descending position is far from clear. I could go on and on about it, but I'm not going to. Maybe a separate video for it might be more appropriate. So let's go back to basically around the final position. So I think it was after g5, move 41, Karpov resigned. And this game, believe it or not, is the first time, it seems, on record, at least according to the ChessGames.com database, that Anatoly Karpov actually lost to Kasparov. So it was like an adjournment game. He didn't want to carry on. The first time he lost in this match in his career to Kasparov, the up and coming Garry Kasparov. So it meant Kasparov avoided humiliation of being wiped out like 6-0, because now it was 5-1 in the match and first to 6. So he avoided the worst basically, and it could be a lot better now. He could maybe feel a lot better that at least he didn't end up with a complete big 0 disaster. Now he clawed this game at least from Anatoly Karpov. Maybe it was like a gift from Karpov saying, okay, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt here to conserve energy. I'm sure I'm going to pick up a win in the next few games. The thing is, interestingly, it never happened. There was a load and load of draws, and then at some point Kasparov then, towards the end of the match, before it was aborted, Kasparov ended up winning 2 games on the trot, and the match was aborted by the FIDE president. But this was the start of the turnaround anyway. It was maybe, Karpov gave Kasparov the benefit of the doubt here instead of fighting on. It's a lot of it maybe about energy conservation as well in the match. Okay, I hope you got something from this game. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.